Welcome to Module 2 of the MELI Unit's Data Analysis and Reporting course. In this module, we will introduce you to key concepts of quantitative data analysis, including basics of response rates and non-response bias, and an introduction to ways to analyze and report data. Let's get started. We'll start with, what is a response rate? Your response rate is the number of people who completed any part of the survey divided by the number of people who received the survey. Let's look at what we mean by received the survey. In your original mailing list, you may have email addresses that bounce back because they are no longer valid. We would remove those from the denominator and only include those respondents who actually received the survey. For example, let's say you send a survey to 1,000 people and all emails are valid and were received by the potential respondents, and you get 200 responses back. Your response rate is 20%. If you have watched our data cleaning module, you may have heard us talk about completion rate. So what's the difference? Response rate refers to the number of people who start a survey but do not necessarily finish it. A respondent could answer one question and still be considered as responding to the survey. Completion rate, on the other hand, refers to the number of people who finish a survey in its entirety. If a survey has 20 questions, a respondent would have to answer all 20 questions to be considered as completing the survey. For example, let's again say you send a survey that reaches 1,000 people, but this time, 250 people respond to the survey, while only 175 complete the survey in its entirety. In this case, your response rate is 25%, while your completion rate is 17.5. So what can be considered a good response rate? There are actually a lot of factors that go into that answer, but for ECA programming, and in accordance with industry best practices, MELI surveys aim for a minimum response rate of 60%. And if you want to know more about response rates, you can read MELI's Survey Response Rates paper, which can be found on our capacity building website. And while 60% is a good baseline expectation for your surveys, that can change for a few reasons. The first is how long ago respondents participated in the program. For ECA evaluations, we have typically seen high response rates for program participants who completed the program within the last 3 years, a lower response rate from participants who completed the program between 3 to 7 years ago, and a much lower response rate from anyone who completed an exchange program more than 7 years ago. Next is the mode of the survey. You can conduct surveys face-to-face, by telephone, or by sending a link through email or some other electronic means. The mode of survey matters quite a bit, and you decide how to do so by thinking about the demographics of your respondent group. For instance, older respondents are generally more likely to respond to online surveys sent via email, as is currently most common. But this distribution method may not get high response rates from younger respondents, who may be more likely to respond when a survey is sent to them via text, WhatsApp, or even social media. Another is internet connectivity. Respondents might have limited access to reliable internet and therefore might not be able to take longer web-based surveys. And lastly is connection to the program. If respondents are actively engaged in an alumni community or have engaged in other activities or components of the program, they might be more likely to respond than respondents who have not had any or much engagement since their program. You can also think about this in terms of which stakeholder groups are more likely to have higher response rates. It is reasonable to assume that alumni will respond to a survey at a higher rate because they were the most actively engaged in the program, whereas you might expect a lower response rate from, let's say, host families, because their engagement with the program is much lower as compared to alumni. A discussion of response rates leads us to need to discuss something called non-response bias. Non-response bias is a problem that occurs when there is a significant difference between those who responded to your survey and those who did not. Essentially, your response rate may not accurately reflect your total population. Let's look at an example. This is your exchange cohort. It has 16 participants, evenly distributed between female and male participants. You distribute a post-program survey and get 10 survey responses for a 62.5% response rate. But when you look at those 10 responses, you realize you received responses from all 8 male participants, but only 2 of the female participants. This means that your survey data does not accurately reflect the opinions of your entire program cohort. The only way to mitigate non-response bias is to increase your response rate. So how do we go about doing that? The first thing to think about is how you design your survey. You want to make sure you are keeping it short and keeping it simple. You also want to think about the best way to reach your respondents. Should we be using text or WhatsApp rather than email? You can also consider using incentives, monetary or otherwise. For example, maybe you want to offer access to mentoring or training modules. And finally, make sure that you're sending reminders to respond to the survey, which is a favored and highly effective MELI strategy. If you can, you want to send these reminders via multiple methods. For example, if you email your survey, try sending follow-up reminders via text or WhatsApp. All right, so how do we go about reporting our survey results? One option is that you can report basic statistics. Essentially, this is just the percent or number of respondents who respond to a certain question. For example, 90% of survey respondents believed that Program A empowers alumni to create change in their communities. You can also use cross-tabulation, also known as crosstabs. Crosstabs are tables that record the number of respondents that have the specific characteristics described in the cells of the table. For example, this crosstab shows business ownership broken down by age categories. Let's look at how we interpret a crosstab. So let's say we want to know how many respondents who own a business are between the ages of 25 and 44 years old. To determine that, we find the business ownership category we're interested in, then look across and narrow down to the age categories we're interested in. In this case, 77.5% of business owners who responded to the survey were between the ages of 25 and 44. Let's look at one more example. Say we want to know how many respondents own a business as a percent of all participants. To determine that, we find the business ownership category we're interested in, then look across to the total column. In this case, the majority, 73.7% of survey respondents, had started a business before participating in the program. We can also look at average scores. This involves taking the average of respondents' numerical scores in order to see how response options rank against one another. For example, consider this question, which asked respondents to rank a series of training sessions from 1, not at all useful, to 5, extremely useful. To conduct this analysis, we take the numeric responses from each respondent for each training session and average them, producing an average score associated with each session. You can then order these averaged scores to determine which responses had the highest or lowest score. And what those highest and lowest scores mean will be dependent on the context of the question you are asking. For this particular example, higher scores indicate more useful sessions, while lower scores indicate least useful sessions. Specifically, respondents found the session on cultural property, art, and antiquities crime to be the most useful, with an average score of 4.95, while the session on administrative and judicial forfeitures was seen as the least useful, with an average score of 4.59. Though, because all sessions scored well over 4, they were all clearly seen as useful components of the training. We can also make comparisons across multiple surveys. Take this example of a pre- and post-survey question, which was sent to the same participants in a survey given both before and after the program. In this case, we would be able to compare responses across the two surveys and say that participants gained a better understanding of the United States. Prior to the program, 70% had positive views of the United States government, increasing to 83% following the program. We'll end by mentioning that there are also advanced statistics you can run on your datasets. For example, regression analysis, which, as the image shows here, is essentially drawing a best fit line through a scatter plot of data points. It helps us understand how one variable might change when another variable changes. This best fit line gives us insights into the relationship between the two variables and helps us make predictions or see trends in the data. Difference in difference analysis compares changes in outcomes between a group that experienced the program to a similar group that did not. This method helps us understand if the program truly had an impact or if the changes would have happened anyway, without having to rely on randomized control groups. You can take whole graduate courses on these analyses, so if you think they're what you want or need for your data set, we recommend that you get help. And that's it for our module on quantitative data analysis. When you're ready, you can head back to the training overview and move on to Module 3 on qualitative data analysis.